Hey everyone, welcome back to InfoGamer. Today I thought it was time for us to do another tutorial on using the PlayFab plugin. In the last lesson we showed you how to set up, create, and display leaderboards. In this lesson we want to talk about using player data. Now before we begin, make sure that you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you can get updates when we publish new videos. And so if we go to our PlayFab dashboard and then click on Players, and then we select the player that we've been using, you can see that there's two types of player data. There's player data title and player data publisher. Player data title is all of the data associated with a specific player in the game that they are currently playing. Player data publisher is all of the data associated with that player across all of the games in a studio. And so you can have shared data across multiple games all associated with one player. Now in this tutorial, we're going to be working with player data title. So I'm going to select that. And in here you can see that there are three different types of player data. There's player data, read-only data, and internal data. And we can see that when information is saved to this PlayFab cloud, all of the information is saved into a key value structure. Now key value pairs are pretty simple. It's basically a way of saving information and having a specific name or key associated with that information. And probably one of the most common uses in Unity of a key value pair is when we use dictionaries. Now I was trying to think of the most beneficial example of information that we can save to our PlayFab cloud. And the example that I came up with is the ability to save unlockable skins or characters to the cloud. And so that's what we're going to do. So here I have my PlayFab project open inside of Unity, and the first thing that I'd like to do is demonstrate the mechanic that we'll be creating in this tutorial. So if I click play, and once it's logged me into my PlayFab account, I'm going to click on this shop button that I created, which will bring up this panel where I have a number of different buttons, and all of these buttons are locked except for the first one. Now when I select one of these buttons, we'll say the last button, you can see that the X over top of this button has disappeared. Now if I stop my game and I hit play again, I'll then click on the shop button again, and here you can see that I still have my orange button unlocked. I then also have this game object called persistent data, which has a script attached to it, and here you can see that I have an array of all skins. So these buttons that I've created are to represent somewhat of a store. And when there's an X over top of a button, then that means that that skin is locked. And so we click on the X to unlock the skin. And as we do so, you can see that the Boolean value of that element in our all skins array becomes true. Now normally all of this information would disappear when we stop our game, but since I have this connected to a PlayFab request, it then saves all of this information to our player data. So if I go back to my PlayFab dashboard and I refresh this page, you can see that we have a new key value pair that's called skins, and we have a binary string that represents each element in our array. And so I have the first skin unlocked, which is the red skin, the last skin unlocked, which is the orange skin, and then the fourth skin unlocked, which is this purple skin. And so we have a set request when we unlock a new skin, and we have a get request when we first start our game. And the last feature I have created is the ability to select an unlocked skin, which will then change this value in our persistent data called mySkin. And so whatever skin I select, it'll set my skin to that element value. And so what we would do if we had this system implemented into one of our games is we would make sure that the persistent data game object was set to don't destroy on load. And then when we load into a game scene or a multiplayer scene, we would then use the mySkin variable to instantiate the skin or the character we have selected. So now let's walk through the process of creating this game mechanic. So the first thing that I did was I created this shop button, and I created it by duplicating my leaderboard button, and then I moved it down in my scene and I changed the text so that it would say shop. The next thing that I had to do was create my shop panel, which is right here. And as you can see, I didn't spend very much time creating this panel. It's basically just a UI image with the anchors in all four corners of the canvas, and then I attached a grid layout group component. The cell size for the grid layout group is 300 by 300, and then I just centered everything in the panel. I then created 12 buttons, which I've called skins, and I've set the color of each one of these buttons. I then set each of these buttons so that they are not interactable, and then I overlapped each of these buttons with another button, which I've called lock. I turned the alpha of these buttons down to 0, and then the text object I made to be the full size of the button, and I added a capital X. You could replace this text image with maybe an actual image of a lock pad, as we have done in our Snake Cube game. Now you're essentially going to want to have one of these skin buttons for every unlockable item in your game. And there's a lot you can do to personally customize your in-app store. But now that we have this panel created and our shop button created, it's time to get on to the code. Now there's two new C# scripts that I created in addition to our PlayFab controller that we'll be working in. The first one is called Menu Controller, which will handle all of the navigation through our menu system. And the second one is called Persistent Data, which will save the information locally that we pull down from the cloud. And then we'll also be working in our PlayFab controller. But let's start by opening up our menu controller. The first thing that we'll need to do in our menu controller script is include the using Unity Engine.UI namespace. Once you have this up at the top, it's time for us to create some variables. The first variable is a public static menu controller, which is the same as our class that we're working in, and I've called this variable MC. This is so that we can create a singleton of this script. The next variable is a public game object, which I've called shop panel. This is so that we can enable and disable that shop panel that we created. The next variable is a public game object array, which I've called button locks. This is to include all of the locks that we have in our in-app store. And the last variable is a public button array, which I've called unlocked buttons. This is so that we can make our skin buttons interactable once we've unlocked them. Once we have these variables, the first thing that we need to do is initialize our singleton. And so in our onEnable function, I've added the line MC equals this. Now from this point, we want to jump over to our persistent data script. Inside this script, the first thing that we need to do is create some more variables. This first variable that I've created is a public static persistent data, which is the same as our class, and I've called this PD. This is for another singleton. The next variable is a public bool array, which I've called all skins. This is for us to determine whether or not we've unlocked a skin or not. And the last variable is a public int, which I've called my skin. This is to determine which skin we have selected. Once we have these variables created, the next thing that we need to do is initialize our singleton. And so in our onEnable function, I've called persistent data.pd equals this. Now if you're implementing this into one of your games, then you're going to want to make sure that persistent data is set to don't destroy on load. And if you set it to don't destroy on load, then you should also be checking if your singleton has already been set. If it's already been set, then you can decide whether you want to keep the old version or keep the new version of your persistent data game object. Now we only have two more functions inside this script, so we'll go through these functions and then we'll jump back over to our menu controller. Now the first function is a public void function, which I've called skins string to data. And this function inputs a string parameter, which I've called skins in. Now when we save data to the cloud, it's saved in that string value structure, and the value is of a string data type. Now when we get that value from the cloud, in order to save it into our all skins array, we're going to need to parse through each character of that string to determine whether each element of our all skins array should be true or false. And so in order to do this, we have this for loop where we have int I equals 0, I is less than skins in, which is our parameter, dot length, which gives us the number of characters in that string. We then have I++, so we're starting at the beginning of the string and going to the end. Inside this for loop, we have an if statement where we are getting the I index of our skins in string parameter, which will give us a character. We then need to take that character and convert it into a string. And from there, we can then use int.parse to convert that string into an integer. We're then checking to see if that integer is greater than 0. If it's greater than 0, then we are taking the I index of our allSkins array and we're setting that element equal to true. We then have an else statement which will do all this same stuff but check to see if it's less than or equal to 0. If it is, then we're going to take the I index of our allSkins array and set it equal to false. Outside this for loop, we are calling this function here, which is called setupStore, and it belongs to our menu controller script. Now we haven't created this function yet, so just type this line in and we'll create it in a second. Now once we have this function created, let's create the last function in this script, which is a public function with a return type of string, and I've called this function skins data to string. So this function up here is called skins string to data and it requires input, whereas this function is called skins data to string and it returns an output. Inside this function we create a local variable called toString with lowercase t, and I've set it equal to an empty string. We then have a for loop with int I equals 0 and I is less than our allSkins array dot length, so however many elements are in our array, and then I plus plus. So we're starting at the beginning of our allSkins array and we're going to the end. Inside this for loop we have an if statement where we're getting the I index of our allSkins array and we're checking to see if that element is equal to true. If it is true, then we're adding a 1 to the end of our toString string. We then have this else statement which is checking the opposite, so if that element is equal to false, then we're adding a 0 to the end of our toString string. And then finally outside our for loop, we are returning our toString variable. Once we have these variables and these functions created, we can then save this script and go back to our menu controller script. Inside our menu controller script, we're going to create this function here, which is a public void function called setupStore. This is the function that we were calling in our persistent data script. We're also going to call this function in our start function. Inside this function, we have a for loop with int I equals 0, and then I is less than persistent data.pd, so we're accessing our singleton. We're then getting the allSkins array and we're getting its length, so however many elements there are. We then have I plus plus, so we're starting at the beginning of our allSkins array and we're going to the end. Inside this for loop, we're accessing the I index of our buttonLocks array and we're setting that game object to either be active or inactive in our hierarchy. And the value that we're passing into our setActive function is the I index of our allSkins array, which will give us a true or false value, but then we're flipping that value using this exclamation mark. And so if we have our skin unlocked, then we want to deactivate the lock button that's on top of it. On the next line of code, we're accessing the I index of our unlock buttons array, which will give us the button component. And from here, we can set whether or not this button should be interactable or not. And the value that we're setting it to is the I index of our allSkins array. And so this will give us whether or not this skin is unlocked. And so if it's true, then we want to activate our unlocked button. And so this function will be called whenever we get data from the cloud or whenever we unlock a new skin. Now let's go on to the next function, which is the function for unlocking skins. This is a public void function which I've called unlockSkin, and I'm passing in an int parameter called index. Inside this function, we want to access our allSkins array by our index parameter and set that element equal to true. We're then calling this function here, which is called setUserData. This is going to be the function that actually saves the data to the cloud. But we haven't created this function yet, and it belongs to our PlayFab controller. And so just type this line of code in and we'll create this function in a second. And this line of code is PlayFab controller.pfc, which is our singleton, .setUserData, and then the value that we're passing in is our persistent data.pd, and then we're calling our skins data to string function, which will return our allSkins array as a string. On the next line of code, we then want to call our setupStore function. And so since we unlocked a new skin, we then need to activate that button. The next function is so that we can open our shop panel. So this is a public void function which I've called open shop, and then inside this function we are accessing our shop panel variable, and then we're calling .setActive and we're passing in true. And finally, the last function in this script is so that we can select a skin that we've unlocked. So this is a public void function which I've called setMySkin, and I'm passing in an int parameter called whichSkin. Inside this function, we are accessing persistentData.pd, so we're getting our singleton. We're then accessing .myskin, and we're setting it equal to whichSkin. Now with all of these functions created, we can then save the script and go over to our PlayFab controller so that we can create our requests. Inside our PlayFab controller, I've created a new region called player data, and the first thing that we're going to do is create our get request to pull down the data from the cloud. And so this is a public void function called getPlayerData. Inside this function, we are calling the getUserData from our PlayFab client API, and I'm passing in a new getUserData request. The values that we're setting for this request are our PlayFab ID. I'm setting this equal to a variable that I've created called myID, and before we go on, we need to initialize this variable. And so up at the top, here I've created this variable. It's a private string called myID, and then anytime we successfully log in to our PlayFab account, we need to set myID equal to result.playfabid. And so this is in our onLoginSuccess function. I also have it here in our onLoginMobileSuccess function, and I have it here in our onRegisterSuccess function. The next value that I'm setting is the keys variable, and I'm setting it equal to null. So the keys variable is used to specify which player data you want to have returned from the cloud. And if you set it equal to null, then it'll just return all of the player data. We then need to have our callback function. So I have this new function called userDataSuccess. And then for the error callback function, I'm just calling one of the ones that I've already created. So for the userDataSuccess, this is a void function, and the parameter is a getUserDataResult, which I've called result. Inside this function, we have an if statement where we're checking to see if result.data equals null, or if result.data does not, I have this exclamation point out in front, contain key, and I'm passing in the string skins, because skins is the key that I'm using for my player data. So this if statement is checking to see if we don't have any data at all, or if we just haven't set the key that we're looking for. If all of these conditions are true, then I'm just debugging a message to the console. We then have this else statement, which means that we do have the key skins. And inside this else statement, I'm accessing the persistentData.pd singleton. I'm then calling the skins string to data function, and I'm passing in result.data, and I'm looking for skins and then the value. So the value will be that binary string, and we're passing it into our skins string to data function, which will take that string, parse it, and convert it into our all skins array. So now that we've created the functions to get the data from the cloud, we now need to call the functions. And so I'm going to do a control find on my get player data. Now, like setting the myID variable, you're going to want to call this function anytime you successfully log into the PlayFab account. So here I have the onLoginSuccess function, and here I'm calling the getPlayerData function. Here I have the onLoginMobileSuccess function, and here I'm calling the getPlayerData function. And finally, here I have my onRegisterSuccess function, and here I'm calling the getPlayerData function. Now this probably isn't necessary because whenever you first register a player, they're not going to have any player data unless it's manually set on the back end. So that's everything that we need to get the player data from the cloud. Now let's talk about pushing player data to the cloud. So here I have a public void function called setUserData. This is the function that was being called in our menu controller script whenever we unlocked a new skin. And this function has a string parameter called skinsData. Inside this function, we are calling the updateUserData function from our PlayFab client API, and we're passing in a new updateUserData request. The values that we need to set for this request are the data variable, and this takes in a dictionary with type string. And so here I'm setting the data variable equal to a new dictionary of type string. The first string is for the key and the second string is for the value. And then inside this dictionary, I'm only setting one element. For the key, I'm passing in the string skins, and for the value, I'm passing in the parameter skins data. We then need to have our callback function, so I've created this new set data success function, and then I'm just calling the same error callback function that I've already created. For the set data success function, this is a void function with a parameter of update user data result, which I've called result. And then inside this function, I'm just debugging the result.data version to the console. So now that we have these functions created, we're already calling our set user data function in our menu controller script when we unlock a new skin. If I go to our menu controller script, you can see here I have my unlock skin function, and right here I'm accessing the PlayFab Controller.pfc singleton and then calling the set user data function, and we're passing in persistent data.pd, and we're calling our skins data to string function, which returns the string value of our all skins array. And so since we're already calling this function, we can go back to our PlayFab controller and save this script. And then we'll go back to Unity. Inside Unity, we first want to create an empty game object called menu controller, and we're going to attach our menu controller script. We then want to set the shop panel variable to the shop panel game object. For the button locks, we want to set it to all 12 lock buttons. For the unlocked buttons, we want to set it to all 12 of my skin buttons. We can then create an empty game object and call it persistent data, and we're going to attach our persistent data script. We then want to make sure that we set the all skins array to the same size of however many unlockable items we have. And so since I have 12 different skin buttons, then I want 12 different booleans. We can then set element 0 equal to true because that's going to be the first default skin. And then we want to make sure that my skin is also set to 0 so that the default skin is selected when we start the game. From here, we then just need to set all the on-click events for the different buttons that we've created. And so here I have my shop button, which is used for enabling our shop panel. And so in the on-click, we want to drag in our menu controller game object, and then we'll use the drop-down menu to select menu controller and then open shop. You'll then want to select all of your skin buttons or your unlocked buttons, and you're going to drag in the menu controller game object and use the drop-down menu to select menu controller and then set my skin. You'll then need to go to each one of these buttons and manually set the parameter. And so this first button is 0, the second button is 1, the third button is 2, the fourth button is 3, and so on. We then need to select all of the locked buttons, and we'll drag in the menu controller game object. We'll then use the drop-down menu to select menu controller and then unlock skin. We then need to select each one of these buttons and manually set the parameter that is being passed in. And so the first lock button is 0, the second lock button is 1, the third lock button is 2, the fourth lock button is 3, and so on. Once you have all of this set up, you should then have a working get and set request for player data. And you should be able to save unlockable items in your game. So I'm going to test my project one more time. So it's logged me into my PlayFab account, and now I'm going to click the shop button. And here you can see I have my shop panel opened, and I'm just going to select all of the skins. And now I'm going to go back to my PlayFab dashboard. Here I can refresh my page, and there you can see that the value of my skins player data is all 1s. So that's everything that I'm going to show you on how to create a player data request using the PlayFab plugin in Unity. Now, a few notes to make. In this tutorial, we only use the PlayFab client API. However, it might be a good idea for certain player data to use the PlayFab server API and cloud scripts. And finally, if you're having any trouble with this lesson, then go over to our website where I've included all of the code for this tutorial. I would ask that you only use our code to check your work. Now, if you like this tutorial, make sure that you give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below or join our Discord server. And then subscribe to our channel so you can be up to date on all our latest videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.